to see us, you wretched woman. But
I know,
eventually.
but I will.
So here we go. Let me just get us
Okay.
out there. Okay, we are live. All right, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. My name is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're delighted to have Elly Griffiths back with us for another virtual chat. And her brand new book is called Bleeding Heart Yard. And I was just saying, I have copies of both iterations. There's the UK edition right here, and we just have a handful of signed copies. I don't know if you can see that with the, and then here's the US edition, which just came out as well. Two very interesting design approaches, and they're both really cool, just quite different. But I will go ahead and put links to both of them in the comments field, should you wish to purchase one. And if you have questions for Elly, just go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. How lovely to see you, Elly. Are you in your garden shed once again? It looks a little more upgraded.
Yeah, I'm in my garden shed. Hi, Barbara. It's lovely to see
Hi.
you, looking as
And you
lovely
too.
as ever.
When I wrote to your publisher and I said she'll be joining me from her garden shed, they said no.
Yes,
Yep.
yes, here I am. It's my. I think I said to you last time that my husband always says I shouldn't call it the shed, because it's quite nice. But anything else sounds a bit pretentious, Oh, it's my studio. It's a shed, basically. But it's a really rough night here. So if you hear like
Oh,
rattling, it's raining, it's wind, it's really is sort of wild night out there. So it's quite atmospheric. So don't worry if you hear like sort of creaking and groaning. It's not me. It's just the weather.
okay. Well, or it's not Stephen King hiding out in the
Well,
in the
there's
garden shed.
in true Stephen King style, there is like a branch of the tree that does bang against the window sometimes. So
Do you know, the weather has been so bizarre. We have had more rain in Arizona since August than Seattle. And, talk about a complete reversal of weather. We've had several events, Michael Conley last week, where, the weather just went wild.
wow,
And there's no predicting it. So
yes,
anyway, let's hope that we don't get cut off. And last time when your most recent Ruth Galloway book came out, John Charles of our staff, who's a major fan, talked to you, but now I've got her back for Harbinder. Yay. So this is, in fact, they're talking about this as a standalone, but honestly, this is Harbinder in her third book. In fact, Elly won an Edgar for The Stranger Diaries and then went on to write The Postscript Murder, both of which were Harbinder Carr down on the seacoast. And in some ways, I think you could compare them to Richard Osman, although not entirely, but it's that same kind of wonderfully English, eccentric, humorous take, and with senior citizens involved, right? But now
yes.
you've moved Harbinder to London. You've taken her back, and she has a more responsible job. So tell us about why she's in London and what's her role.
Yeah, so she's had promotion and she's moved to London. And yes, you're absolutely right, Barbara. It kind of is a standalone, but it is also part of a sort of series because it's the
Yeah.
third book to have Harbinder in. And they're all a little bit different. So the first one, The Stranger Diaries, is a kind of sort of modern Gothic story. And as you said, Postscript Murders is a little lighter, a little cozier, I guess. And this is the third one. Now, the writer Sophie Hannah, when she talks about her books, she says they're linked attached. Like houses are sometimes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with that. They're linked attached. So in this book, she gets promotion. She moves to London, and it's quite a big deal for Harbinder because it's promotion and it's a new place. But also, she's up till now really been living with her parents in her sort of mid-30s. She's gay. She's out to her parents, but not completely. So this is a whole new sort of chance for her. She shares a house with two other women. She has two housemates, and she's got this responsible job. And her first case is a prominent politician who drops dead at his school reunion. So it's very high profile. So it's all changed for Harbinder in this book.
It really has. Now, describe to me what yard means in your title, because it means a different thing to American readers.
Well, it's a real place. It's near London Bridge in London, right in the centre of London. And I know you know London really well, Barbara. And it's really, it's a courtyard. I guess it's short for courtyard because it's just like a little square space, cobbled space between buildings. And there's only sort of one entrance and exit. So it's a little bit claustrophobic seeming and sort of high buildings all around it, but it's a cobbled courtyard. So I guess that's what it's called. And there's a restaurant there. So this is where I found it, was once a year I meet up with my old friends from publishing, because I used to be an editor and I worked for HarperCollins, and a group of us have kept in touch, and we always meet for lunch. And just before sort of COVID and lockdown, we had a lunch in the lovely restaurant in Bleeding Heart Yard, and I thought, oh, I've got to remember that. I've got to remember that as a title. And when I had the idea about Harbinder moving to London and this whole school reunion thing, I thought, I know how I'm going to tie it in.
I love that. Well, we really are two people divided by a common language. And, you say garden shed, but we say yard, not garden most of the time.
Yes.
Garden in America is more pretentious. Most homes have what we refer to as a yard. If you have a garden, it's going to be, much higher scale, all the rest of it. But courtyard, I agree that, that it is indeed short for courtyard. And,
I think if we said yard, we would expect it to be concreted over, more like a builder's yard. But
yes.
If there's any grass, you'd say garden, even if it was tiny. But yes, it's so interesting, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And we did talk about digression here. And maybe I can even show it to you. We decided that we would light our garden for Christmas this year. And so these people came in, and we have a giant saguaro. I mean, it is a serious saguaro. And they arrived with 2 bucket trucks, and they spent an entire day twining the saguaro in all of its arms with Christmas lights. And then they did a tree over on the other side, and then across the front of the house. I'm telling you, the neighborhood is just like ablaze, and I have no idea whether our neighbors are unhappy with it. But
it sounds wonderful.
It really is. I'm looking for I can show you the photo here on my phone, or I can email it to you. But it's sort of fun to see it.
Do.
But anyway, here it is. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I can. So this is how it looks.
That's huge. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
it looks like it's sort of got diamonds on it or something. That's beautiful. Wow.
It really does. But this is the first time, my point was, that I felt that we had a garden as opposed to a yard.
I see, right. I hadn't really realized that distinction. Yeah, because definitely for us, yard would be concreted over and maybe kind of industrial in some way. But however little, here it's a garden, and my garden's not very big, but it has a shed in it, and this is where I am.
I love it. All right, so we've now kind of cleared up the mystery of the title. Yeah. And in fact, as Patrick pointed out, the covers are, the cover designs are very different. And, the thing is, if Elly will show you the UK cover is quite a lot different. And, I think that's really interesting, because clearly there are whole platoons of people at publishers whose job is to try to figure out what the packaging is that will work for every country. And if you get foreign editions, then I'm sure you're frequently surprised by, what they decide, and they can change the title as well. Authors don't get to do that. Authors own the copyright to the text, to the story, but the publishers get to decide on the typography and the packaging and the cover art. And most of the time, the title may be in conference with the author. I don't think readers often realize that you're not in total control of your book.
No, and that's true. And of course, as I was just saying, I used to be in publishing. And do you know, the thing that we dreaded was the author who had views on the cover. The author that says, well, I really think it should be like this, because it is. And I try and remember this as an author, because it is really a marketing tool, as you so rightly said. And of course, the marketers want to sell it to bookshops like yours. So they want the thing that totally appeals, and that's really important. It's a marketing tool, really. But I do think it's interesting, because quite often, my books are published sort of around the world now. I think it's 25 different countries, including sort of Far East and things like that. Most of the covers are quite like the British covers, but the American ones are kind of out on a limb. They are quite different, particularly with the Ruth books, those very sort of colourful ones.
Yes.
And it's really interesting how that's worked. And I actually really love this US cover of Bleeding Heart Yard. And I think the thing is, this isn't I haven't got the final one here. This is a proof, but you can see it actually has the flower that is a bleeding heart on it. So I suppose it kind of looks quite sort of slightly gothic-y, slightly sort of literary. But I think this looks more crimey.
I do too. Plus, it
And
actually looks like the place where the crime
it
is
does.
happening.
And
So
that idea of sort of stepping into, one of these lovely London streets. I think it has, ironically, of course, because it's not done in London, I feel it has a really London feel to it. So actually, for me, that probably might represent the book slightly better.
well, I think it probably does. Plus, I'm not sure Americans would even recognize the bleeding heart flower. So it'd just
Well,
be
I had to have it pointed out to me.
right. So anyway, let's talk a bit about dark academic, because all of a sudden this subgenre, so to speak, I love the way that books keep sort of sorting out. I predicted, you might, and I might have even talked about this 2 or 3 years ago, when people are always saying to me, what'll be the next big thing? And I said it was going to be the Gothic. I said the Gothic was due a revival. But now we have the dark academic mystery, which is like a kind of a subgenre of the Gothic. It tragically, at least in this country, we are seeing a lot of really terrible dark academic things happen, like the shooting at the University of Virginia. But what do you understand dark academic to be? And here it's usually summed up by Donna Cart in The Secret History, but I think Joanne Harris has written a couple of absolutely crackerjack.
So do I. The Narrow Door. That's an excellent one. Yes. I'm a big Donna Tartt fan, though, actually. And, when was it out? It was the 90s, wasn't it? I think I read The Secret History was before I was published at all. And yeah, I absolutely loved it. I love The Goldfinch as well. Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it, how things come round again. And I mean, you must see that very much in sort of your position in the sort of literary world. You must see that quite a lot. And even I remember it from sort of publishing things sort of coming around again. I suppose it is because there is an element of locked room mystery about a school or a university, and there is this sort of, small group of characters, and you can play on that, and you can play on the fact that I think the characters in my book, there's not very much actually in school, but of course they're at a school reunion, so they're remembering their school days, which were 21 years ago, and that there is that sort of sense of remembering the days when you were sort of 18, 19, 20, were just such formative years in your life, and they have a disproportionate effect on you, don't they? For example, I think of the sort of music I like. It's probably nearly all music that I got into at university, sort of very, very influenced by my friends then. So those sort of tastes, I think I can't remember it exactly, but there's actually a lovely piece in The Secret History where Richard says that. He says, everything was formed in me by this group of friends at school. So I think that probably accounts for some of the allure of it. And I think I read somewhere that dark academia became quite a thing again during lockdown. And I don't know, maybe because we were all locked down. I don't know. There's a locked room aspect of it. But it is, yes, it's really interesting and done well. I think it can be really good. And I totally agree about that Joanne Harris series. So
well, I do too, but just thinking about it, Joanne is writing when people are actually in school. So I forgot about Ruth Ware, her most recent book, It Ends With Us. And then she wrote an earlier one, maybe it was her first one, I think, about a school reunion. So she too has, has gone in. So I'm not sure that the defining thing of dark academics simply means that there's a school in the background, and it's kind of a variation on a country house murder in a way, because what it really means is that there's a confined space of some kind, whether it's an actual campus or whether it's a group of people who were, and those are the people where the crime occurs to one of them and all of them are the suspects, right?
I think that's exactly right. I think it's a version of locked room or closed circle, a mystery, really. And I absolutely loved Ruth Ware's The It Girl, the most recent one, set in Oxford. Very, very clever. Yes. And I'm a real sucker for that sort of story, I have to say.
Yeah, I thought she did it very well. I was briefly confusing her with Colleen Hoover, which of course is absurd, but there's no parallel. Titles, I mean. Anyway, I've heard this one called Dark Academic, but that's not what you have been writing. I mean, you've been, well, I don't know. Do you suppose Ruth Galloway, do you think they could be kind of called Dark Academic? I hadn't
Yes.
even thought of it.
No, I hadn't at all. But she is an academic, isn't she? She works at a university, and I think because she works at a kind of modern university, um, I suppose you don't have that kind of sort of sense of the sort of dark cloistered halls. She briefly works in Cambridge, and I think
Right.
then you get a little bit more. I suppose it's because those sort of modern campuses don't really call to that sort of book. So I wouldn't have necessarily, but I
No.
mean, she is an academic, so we could make a claim for them being. And I guess the secret history, not the secret history. See, now I'm doing it. The Stranger Diaries.
Right.
That's partly set in a school as well. So
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I don't like labels, and so I mean, in a way, I tend to push back when somebody says, "Oh, look, it's a dark academic mystery," and I think I'm doing another talk this afternoon with two writers of dark academic
oh
mystery,
wow.
a debut by Lauren Nassett and then Ashley Winstead, and I think in a way one of them is looking hard at the fraternity system here. I think here they're partly inspired by all the really terrible things that are happening on college campuses, but that's not really what your book is about. And if this is I wish we could talk about the ending of this book because it's really wonderful,
Well,
but
we'll have to do it just ourselves, but
really scary to even contemplate it. But anyway, Harbinder, here she is. She's in London. She's been promoted. She's not living with her parents. Has she, is her being gay a problem with her Indian community? I mean, her parents are kind of just, is that a little awkward for her? London would be more comfortable, surely.
I think that's right. I want to show, that her parents are very loving and very accepting. They absolutely, do accept her because they love her. But I think possibly for the wider community, sort of culturally, I know friends with that sort of cultural background. I think possibly it is a little difficult for her. So I think, and just generally, it's just easier to live away from home, isn't it? I think, although she always says she loves living at home, and especially her mum's cooking, and she has great relationship with them. But I think it is a little easier for her to be. And she mentions as well, it's really great to live in London, which is a multicultural city. And I took something that she says, something that a friend of mine from the same background, sort of Punjabi Sikh background, she said when she moved to London, every time she saw a man wearing a turban, she thought they were a family member because she'd come from a place where they were the only Sikh family. And Harbinder thinks that at first. So I think she likes the diversity of London, and she wants to sort of stretch her wings. She says a couple of times it's taken her a long time, and she's only really moved 60 miles away from home, but she has done it. So I think I think it is an exciting moment for her, really.
Well, it is. And do I assume from this that you're thinking about expanding her range? She's such a great character. You've written three. Are you going to continue to write books with Carpenter in them?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad you like her. I
Ooh,
I had sort of thought this would be the last one, really, because it kind of I don't know, it sort of moves her on to a different place, I guess. So I thought this might be the last one, but I have since had an idea for another one. So I think it won't be the last one. And actually, I quite liked writing about her team there in London. She has a new sergeant called Kim, as an older woman who she really likes, and a slightly annoying younger man there. So I think there are potential there. And also at the end of the book, she meets up with her friends from the postscript murders again. And I'd love to do something with them again, because Natalka, one of the characters there, who's Ukrainian, and I'm really quite sad that her Ukrainian backstory is still so topical, really. But Natalka has started her own detective agency along with 80-year-old Edwin. So I'd quite like to write about them as well. So I don't think I'm finished with the characters yet.
I'm really glad to hear that. I just assumed that because you were opening up the stage, so to speak, that you intended to do that. And of course, I live in fear that you're someday going to wind down the Ruth Galloway series, which is one of my all-time favorite series. And I have been there since the beginning, I like to say.
You really have supported them. Well, I've said that the next Ruth, which is called The Last Remains, is the last for a bit. So there is going to be a bit of a pause after that one, but I'm not finishing them forever, no.
Oh, good. I'm happy to hear that you said the last for a bit because, I mean, it's a complicated story. We're digressing off into Elly's other work here, but if you've missed the Ruth Galloway mysteries, they are really spectacular. And I love the Norfolk countryside. I love, all of the interesting, there's some unusual elements in them. There's some really unusual characters in them. There's been a lot of character arc, progress, and so forth going on. So, but I can understand that you might want to take a break. What about your Brighton mysteries before I go back to Harbinder? Are you going to continue those?
Yeah, I'm writing one at the moment. It's called The Great Deceiver, and it will be out next fall, next autumn. So yeah, I will carry on with those. And yes, I guess with the thing with Ruth is that there is this storyline, as you said, these many story arcs. There's a sort of major one of her and Nelson, and I kind of want to bring that to a bit of a conclusion in this book. So it seems sort of a time to pause a little bit. But it's and also I don't want to. I only want to write them, when I'm feeling that they're going to be absolutely at their best, I guess. So I sort of feel that it's time for a little bit of a break. But
Sure. No, I think I think that makes perfectly good sense. The thing that's wonderful about having different characters is that then different stories can occur to you. So a story that Ruth would never work might actually, be perfectly good for Harbinder or for some other character. And people who write just one long series, well, those are wonderful and I love them. Do sort of shut off some potential storylines that that could be developed if you had other characters in them. So
that's so true, actually, because quite often I'll have an idea and I'll think, oh, could that be a Ruth idea? And you just kind of know, oh, maybe that's not a Ruth idea, but maybe it is a Harbinder idea. Part of Bleeding Heart Yard. When I thought of Bleeding Heart Yard, I first thought, well, maybe I could bring Ruth to London, do something with her. But it didn't seem to work with her. But with Harbinder, it really did seem to work. So you're absolutely right with that. Yes, and also I've got a few ideas for some new things. So I'd quite like to start a new series as well. So I want to give myself a little bit of time to think about that.
I think that's very, very wise. Now let's talk a bit about Cassie Fitzherbert, because Harbinder in some ways she's the investigating character here, but Cassie, who has a really complicated story, she's really I think the character that her story is the one that pushes all the way through the book to either or not be resolved at the end. So tell us about Cassie.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right, because Harbinder is sort of third person character, and she's she's the investigator, she's the police side, and they're solving the case. But we do see it from two different points of view as well, and we see it from the point of view of Cassie Fitzherbert. And the first thing she says in the first line of the book, so I'm not giving anything away, is it possible to forget that you've committed a murder? And she committed a murder when she was at school with her group of friends, the group. And, she's put it to the back of her mind to such an extent that she's now a police officer, well-liked, well-respected police officer in Harbinder's team. But then when somebody dies at the school reunion, she's clearly a witness, if not a suspect. So there's her story that goes through it, and also the story of Anna Vance, who's another one of their circle at school, who's a kind of outsider. She wasn't as sort of wealthy as the other students, and she has in recent years sort of been living in Italy away from them all, but now she's come back. So her story feeds in as well. So actually, I suppose in a way, Cassie and Anna are every bit as important as Harbinder in the story.
Well, and then we also have, there is a victim. We also have a bit of a story from the victim. I don't know if we want to reveal who it is because, he's not like dead at the first page. And so, it's kind of good to read along that way. You work out that if they've gone to a class reunion, that one of the classmates is probably going to be killed. But I'm not sure. This is really a sophisticated story, a very sophisticated plot. Do you think you could have written it when you first started out?
Oh, what a good question. I don't know. I don't think I could actually,
Yeah.
because I think certainly I have become a little bit more ambitious in plotting and confidence. And The Stranger Diaries was my first standalone, and as we've explored, it ended up not being a standalone. But it was the first book actually where I didn't have a written plan. It was the first book where it was all just in my head. And it's my most complicated plot. Up to then, it was my most complicated plot because it's again told in three voices, and it also weaves in a Victorian ghost story that I wrote. So it sort of weaves all this into the book, and it was quite ambitious. And because I sort of pulled that off, I thought, oh, I can do this, and I haven't, gone back to doing a sort of chapter plan. I've just sort of trusted myself a bit more, and I was looking back with my editor Jane. I did a little sort of podcast thing with my editor because I've had this. You know Jane Wood, of course you do,
I
don't you?
do.
Yeah, and she's wonderful, as you know. She's edited all my books, and we went back and we looked at the crossing places, and she had the very first edition of it there that I'd signed for her in such a wonky Elly Griffiths signature because I didn't know how to do it. It was very funny. But we looked, and the plot is really not so good. There are good things I do think to say about the book, the character of Ruth and the atmosphere
Yeah.
and the setting and the place, but the plot is quite simple. I don't think I had quite enough suspects there. So, and I remember a friend saying to me who wrote for, you get over there, don't you, the Midsummer Murders. And a
Yes.
friend of mine called Isabel Gray wrote for Midsummer Murders, and she says the rule there is that they've always got to be four people left standing at the end who could have done it, and that's always been my rule ever since. So I think I've got better at that. So I do. That was a really good question, and I don't think I could have done it at the start of my career, and also wouldn't have had the confidence to do it.
Well, yeah, I think there's both. Confidence is certainly a big part of it. But one of the reasons that I asked you that question is that you're really an ace at withholding information and gradually, because we don't know why Cassie says, could I forget that is it possible to forget that I committed a murder? And we don't even know what murder it is or who died or whatever. And I think to write a book where you put that out there, but then it's so you leak things into the story as you go along. That takes a lot of control, I think, to
Oh,
do that
thank
kind
you.
of thing. I was really impressed. And
Oh,
it's not that often that I can't figure out what happened. But I have to say that the end of this book did indeed catch me by surprise. I thought
oh,
he has written
I'm so
himself into a
pleased
corner here.
because
And I thought,
you're
how is she going to get out? But you did.
oh, good.
Right. And kudos to Jane. If Jane ever watches this, I miss you. I haven't seen you for
Oh,
a really long time. We had lunch at the Ivy once together,
oh,
which I've
lovely.
always remembered. But Jane is indeed a brilliant editor.
She
So, but
really is. And
yeah, yeah,
a lunch with Jane is always good, isn't it? It's always a good lunch.
it is.
Yeah, and of course, she is a terrific editor and has really helped me so much along the way. But I'm so happy to hear you say that, Barbara, because you read so much crime fiction. So I'm very, very glad that I have, at least put a few doubts in your head as you read it. But I think that is so important, isn't it, about when to give the information. And it
Yeah,
is something that, we're all learning all the time, aren't we? But because you don't want to annoy your readers, because sometimes, occasionally, I read a book where the detective says, "Oh, I know who did it, but I won't tell you." And you think,
yeah,
"Oh, but why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Why would you say to your closest aide?" Well, Poirot does it all the time, but I guess we can forgive him. "Oh, I do know these things, but they will not tell you." And you think, why not? You might. So things like that withheld just for the sake of it are really annoying. So you want to withhold it a little bit, don't you? But not in such a way as to the way that you are then sort of obstructing justice, if you like. You've just got to, in a way, try and do it naturally, and people telling their stories and bits come out. But I'm glad you think that I pulled it
well,
off.
I do. And the thing is that the stakes for Cassie are really huge. I mean, because she has a family, she has a career that she loves. She's a police officer. And if it comes out that in fact, she committed a murder, her whole life is going to be blown up. So you don't know. I mean, in theory, we have a murder and a murderer, and we have Cassie and her past, but we're not entirely clear whether Kathy is in fact guilty of both or guilty of neither. And if she isn't guilty of neither, then what you've really created is an impossible crime. You're going to have to resolve in a way that we can believe it. So I think you set the stakes up in this book for your characters, but also for yourself, really high. Now, did you plot this out ahead of time, or are you becoming more of a pantser where you wrote yourself along and figured it out? What happened?
I definitely am becoming more of a pantser, definitely. As I did sort of start off, as I said, with a sort of plan that would go from the beginning to the end. I mean, it'd be very sketchy and I'd fill a lot in on the way. But first, when I first started writing, I did always know who did it. And actually I did know in this one, but I didn't sort of know how I was going to get there. So in the structure is, you get a chapter or so from Cassie and then Anna and then Harbinder, and I wasn't always sure in which order they would go, as I went through it. So it wasn't planned out to that extent, And somebody asked me today, actually, was on a lovely podcast, and they said, did you write, say, all the Harbinder bits and all the Cassie bits and all the Anna bits and put them together? But I mean, it's a very fair and interesting question, but it's just I couldn't write like that. I have to sort of start at the beginning, go to the end. So I wasn't even sure which bit would unfold next. So, and lots of, they're a group of people, as we were saying, who close at school, haven't seen much of other for the next 21 years. So there are quite a lot of relationship stuff to unravel and, resentments within the group and some sort of social resentments. Anna was not as rich as the others. Some of the others have become so famous that they've almost, fame does that thing to people, doesn't it? It makes them seem very other. So all those things I wanted to explore.
Very true. And the thing is that the wounds that you're dealt in high school, you almost never get over. There's a wonderful woman's book. I mean, this book, I think it's called In Her Boots by a writer named Del Antonia. And the plot really is premised off, can you ever get over the guy that dumped you in high school? And I mean, and it's true that you are at your most vulnerable, your emotions are highest, your hormones are highest, life is rawest, whatever it all is, when you're a teenager, when you're in your late teens, and those things can carry over your entire life, which I've often thought is the reason there are so many books that are really set at high school reunions or college reunions, because those wounds just never really seem to heal.
Yes, I think that's really true, actually, and you are so. It is such a point in your life where everything sort of gets decided. Funnily enough, when I was at university, I had a boyfriend called Chris, who was a medical student and became a doctor. But when I was writing this book, I realized it was the first time I'd ever had a character called Chris. So I don't know what that means. Maybe it means, that in some ways Chris is history, or I really chose the name Chris because I could play a little game with spelling it with a C and with a K, and so, but it could have been Carl, couldn't it? It didn't have to be Chris. So maybe I've sort of carried something about Chris all these years, but obviously I'm happily married for 30 years. But maybe there was a little thing about Chris that needed to come out in this book. I don't know. So it's very interesting. I've kept a diary since I was 11, and yeah, and when you look back, it's really worth looking back because your feelings are so intense, even at sort of 11, 12. I really loved a boy called Antonio, and I followed him around a lot when I was 11. And, it's worth remembering that.
It really is. I was invited to speak to an honors class at Arizona State University a couple of weeks ago. And then subsequently, we did an event, and an author named Daniel Pink, who's a nonfiction writer, has written a terrific book called The Power of Regret. And basically, the theme of my conversation to these kids, and also Dr. Pink's conversation, was, as you grow older, you learn to forgive yourself for the things that the choices that you made and the things that went wrong. But what you never really get over is regret for the things that you didn't do, that you didn't choose. And it's hard to explain that to kids who are like 20 years old because they barely even made any choices. But, I mean, when I was invited to do it, I said to the dean, who actually attended the class, which I thought was very nice, said there are only two things I'm qualified to speak about to these kids. One is aging gracefully, and the other is how to run a small business. But I realized as I was speaking to them, and they were sort of recovering from the aging part because they're going, no, can't be true, is that what I was really talking to them about was avoiding regret. And, that really is a very, at 82, I can look back and think about all the stupid stuff I did. And my husband, we've been married now for 33 years, but we are not each other's first spouses. And every once in a while, if I start that, he'll say to me, every choice that you made means we are here. We are here leading this life, our best lives together, and so there's no point in going back and saying, I wish I had, or, how could I have been so, or whatever. And he's absolutely right. He really
is. And
yeah.
I bet your talk was absolutely inspiring, although they would have laughed their heads off if you'd said your age, because you.
Well, I did. No. We talked about
don't.
it.
Look
But
age.
what's really interesting is I got a thank you letter from the dean, who attended the class, and I wrote her a follow up to what I could have. It's hard to really sum up a lot of things in a relatively short period of time. And it was also Halloween. So I knew that all those kids were perishing to get out of the room and put on their costumes and go, so I didn't want to be cruel and make them stay there too long. So I wrote up a summary about the different things that I had done and how that, by being, a general undergraduate education means I can really talk to anyone about anything. I don't have to go look stuff up. Being a librarian taught me a lot of things about, organizing things and finding things, and, which plays into running a bookstore. Reading the law gives you problem solving, aspects and long range thinking and all kinds of other things. And so each of the things that I did, whether I pursued them all the way or they didn't pan out, led me to where I am at the moment. Now, it's true that you have to live this long in order for all that to work out. If something takes you out at 50 and, you never got to that point, then you have a different problem. But I think I was trying to say to them that, even if you have false starts, or even if you pursue something and it doesn't work, and in today's age, I said to them, what if you had gotten a really terrific, tech background and gone to work for for Twitter. And then Elon Musk came along one day and fired everybody, and your golden future that you thought was all assured just blew up, and it wasn't your fault.
Yes.
How do you cope with that?
Yes, it's so true, and that's so interesting. About regrets and about everything teaching you something that the head teacher at my kids' school used to say is that success is a poor teacher. So if you always succeed at everything, you're not really going to learn, are you? And I certainly think of things that I have not been good at, have really teach you some of the setbacks that you have. And I guess also in books, you put that into books, don't you? Because a lot of novels are about making certain choices at certain times, aren't they?
They really are. If you didn't have your career in publishing, it's not, I'm sure that your career as an author, I'm not sure, I suspect that your career as an author might have gone differently,
Oh, definitely. Yeah. But also because I came out of publishing to have my kids, my twins, that's when I wrote my first book. So if I hadn't have done that, then I wouldn't have had them, which would have been the worst thing of all, but I wouldn't have written a book. And, I worked in a library, and I didn't much like it at the time, I have to say, though I love libraries now, but it certainly taught me a lot. Yes, absolutely. I worked in sales once, telesales, and that taught me that I'm very bad at telesales, but oh my God, nothing is ever going to be as bad as ringing someone up and wanting them to buy advertising space. So everything teaches you something.
Well, and being an author, absolutely everything you ever did can play into your books, so that's useful. But in point of fact, circling back, back to the book, which is sort of why we're here, it does apply to both Cassie and Harbinder, this whole discussion. If Cassie hadn't made those choices, then she wouldn't be in the place she is when the book starts. and Harbinder wouldn't be in her new promotion in London. And, you know, I think that's one of the really neat things about writing a character more than once, is that you get to show us, you know, how choices and
Yes.
continuing choices change them. If you write a total standalone, then the only thing we get to read is what choices, you know, drove the standalone, but then we leave them and we'll never know whether the things that happened in the standalone then transform their lives as they move forward.
Yes, and there's always that feeling that you would quite like to know, isn't there? I mean, so many
Mhm.
books that where I'd like to know what happened. When I can't sleep, I sometimes try and work out what happened next in Georgette Heyer books, because you know I'm a big Georgette Heyer fan.
Oh, me
Always
too.
try, always try, and you know, and it's sort of tempting to think, of what happened next? You know, what happened next to Damarel and Venetia and Penn and Richard and those
Nope.
last little bits. So I think that is one of the big wonderful things about writing a series. And in the Ruth book that I've just finished, Ruth 15, I did try to tie up some of the loose ends from previous books and to sort of show that the choices Ruth made and Nelson and Cathbad and the rest of them have led them to this place. So yes, it's a
I
really
know. I've
interesting
always
book.
wanted to know, because Cotillion was my mother's very favorite
Oh,
Georgette Heyer.
Freddie.
Yep. And I've always wanted to know what happened to them. And you remember, Hugh, one of the
Yeah.
great lines in Georgette Heyer, remember when there's the five, bravo, cried Hugh, forgetting his cloth because he was a rector, or Freddie's father, you know, who was
Yes.
just like superb. And
Yeah.
but they were such a young couple, and they, you know, they wound up together under difficult circumstances, and you leave them when they're just like still teenagers, and you'd really like to know how their life,
Yes.
did Freddie turn into his father, you know, what
I love
happened.
his father. He's such a good cat, and I think they were well suited, really, and that showed it because
Yeah,
Jack, who's the sort of dashing one, isn't he? He wasn't at all as considerate as Freddie, and Kitty liked doing the same things that he liked doing, so I think they would have been happy. But what, yeah, so interesting, and I think, yeah, I think Venetia and Damarel would have been happy, even though he was quite a tricky husband.
good point. And what about Charles and Sophie, you know, I
Oh,
mean,
oh yes. I think they would argue a lot, but they would be really happy, you know. And
they would.
I think there's that beautiful scene where she's looking after her cousin, Charles' little sister, and Charles sees her at the bedside and realizes her really sterling qualities. So I think she will always have that wonderful sort of motherly quality that he will
I
love.
agree. I mean, I
Oh,
think in many ways, the best Georgette here in many ways is a civil contract. But,
oh
you know,
yes,
I mean, that's just it's an absolutely brilliant, it's one of the best Napoleonic Regency War, you know, depictions that you can read. And it ends, in fact, when news of Waterloo comes in, and,
yes,
you
they're
know,
waving the papers out of the windows. And do you know
yes,
it's a very grown-up book, though, isn't it? Because
yes,
I
that's,
reread that fairly recently, and I remember not liking it. And when I reread it a couple of years ago, I thought this is brilliant.
oh, it really is brilliant. And, you know, it is so much about the choices that, you know, society and money and life and, you know, parents and all foist upon you. But I have to tell you, Ellie, that for many, many years, thinking about Mr. Charlie, whose most redeeming feature is that he likes sang de boeuf Chinese porcelain. For many, many years, I have gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I have always headed for the sang de boeuf vase. There is one in the Met, and it's the only sang de boeuf, which basically is Chinese oxblood. It's a particularly
Yes.
fabulous porcelain finish. And you know, every time I go, I think it's my own personal tribute to
Oh,
Mr.
that's so,
Charlie at Georgette here, you know,
because
is
he
to visit
loved it,
that.
didn't he? He
Yes, he
loved it
did.
for itself. He
Yep.
really had
Yep.
that sensitivity to do that. And sometimes Georgia Hare can be quite snobbish, but she
Yeah.
does show that he was a not an aristocrat, but he had that absolute love of those beautiful things. So, and there's a good bit in,
Recognized, yep, she recognized in that book that no person is all just one thing. You
yes,
know,
that's
she
really
gave them
true.
facets, I think, of their, I think it's the most adult book of all,
Yeah.
because a lot of them are, you know, like Young Love's Dream or whatever it might be. But anyway, anybody
Gosh,
that reads Georgette
yes,
here is going to be
we
a
went off.
brilliant stylist, and, you know, yay for Ellie. So why don't we call Patrick up and see if he has, because we can't really say much more about this book. You know that Cassie wonders if she killed somebody and can't remember it. Harbinder is going to have to figure this case out. Um,
And
We
you
can't
get
really
to
tell you
know
anymore.
bits of London, and you get to travel to Bleeding Heart Yard, and you get to find out all the secrets. That's all
So
we can
next
say.
time we talk to Ellie, I'm going to tell everybody ahead of time, and then we can actually discuss what happened. It's going to be a requirement that you have read Bleeding Heart Yard, or you're going to have spoilers. All right, Patrick, what do we have? Anything?
Let's see. Well, let's see. There's a question that just came in from Norby, who says, is there anything you'd personally avoid or have you avoided when writing a book?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Anything I personally avoided? Well, I guess there are lots of things really, because as Barbara and I've been saying in our chat, it's all choices, isn't it? And I personally don't like reading really sort of graphic violence, or that sort of thing, sort of gruesome description. So I would certainly avoid that. I would say, not to say that murder's not violent, and it's one of the kind of slight issues I have sometimes when people call crimes cozy, because murder's never cozy, is it? So murder is violent, but I would always kind of avoid the describing it in too graphic or gratuitous a way. So that's something that I'd avoid really. And there's probably, I would also avoid really writing about any true crime. And I know that it can be done so well, and maybe I wouldn't feel like that if it was a true crime that had been committed sort of in Victorian times, but where there's a chance that anyone might be alive who remembered it, that's also something I would avoid. I hope that's answered the question.
Right.
If not,
Yeah.
tell me.
People often say they would avoid writing about children, children being murdered and things like that.
Yes, I mean, I really would upset me to write that. I'm not sure I would totally avoid it though. I certainly, there've been a couple of child abductions in my books, and of course it is something that it's the big dread, isn't it? But I don't think I would altogether avoid writing about it. Sometimes there's a really chilling but good quote from Cesare Pavese, and he says, "The things you fear in secret always happen," which I hope. Definitely don't think that's true, but sometimes I think things that you slightly are scared of writing, maybe you should write them. I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's see here. Well, somebody was talking about, let me see if I can find it, at the beginning of the program. Why would Americans not recognize a bleeding heart flower? She says, we grow them. An interesting question.
Well, I guess it's just if you know flowers or not.
Yeah, right.
And I quite often don't know the names for things. I would recognize it, but I had to be told that was a bleeding heart flower. And a great name it is too. I love those old names, like sort of Old Man's Beard and things like Love Lies Bleeding. Great names.
What's interesting is I heard just recently a little fact about the Beatles, the song Ticket to Ride. We've heard that in our entire lives, but I had no idea that meant an actual ticket, and Ride was a town in England. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Very
Is it in on the Welsh border? Because of course Liverpool's
It may
right.
be, yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. A
I
ticket to
didn't know
ride.
that.
Yeah, there we go. A very short digression.
Well, a very interesting one.
Let's see here. Carol would like to know, would you ever consider combining the 3 series in some way? Do you think of them as existing in the same world at the same time?
What a terrific question, Carol. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I suppose the fact that I haven't ever considered it must mean that I do think of them as being in different universes, really. But the only thing I've sometimes thought is that maybe Ruth might find a playbill that has Max Mephisto's name in it from the Brighton Mysteries, and that would sort of cross over in that way, because that would be something that was in history, and she wouldn't have a chance of sort of meeting him. I do remember, as I write this series for schools, which I know you've had in the shop, the Justice series, not for schools, but for sort of younger readers from sort of 8+. And I go into schools quite often to talk about them, which I love doing. And I was really sorry when I couldn't do it during lockdown, so it's nice to do it again. And somebody asked me there, so a young student, about some 8 or 9, he said, could Justice be Ruth's grandmother? And I thought, that's such a good question. And I
Interesting.
sort of don't think she is, because Ruth's mother is quite a difficult woman and
Yeah.
somebody who sort of uh, doesn't access her sort of emotional and creative side. And I think if Justice had been her mother, she wouldn't have been like that. So I think Justice isn't Ruth's grandmother, but it's an interesting thought, isn't it?
Mhm.
So there might be
Absolutely.
a tiny bit of crossover there somewhere, maybe with the Brighton mysteries and Ruth, maybe. But I hadn't really thought about it. What would Harbinder think of Nelson? Who knows? How interesting that would be. I'm not sure. I'm not sure she would, take to him that much. I think he'd have to be really on his toes. But then again, he's used to strong women. He likes Ruth. He's works with Judy and Tanya. His mom is a strong woman, so probably he'd be all right.
Let's see here. Okay, here's a kind of a question. What do you have a favorite mystery novel of all time? If you had to pick, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Barbara,
I
do
would.
you have one? That's a dangerous one for you
Well,
to ask.
here's the thing. I was asked that yesterday. I did a PBS interview downtown, and he asked me if I had a favorite author. And I said, it's really dangerous for me to say that. But if I'm picking one, because I just got a book from Bloomsbury where I wrote the last chapter in a book about Agatha Christie. And so I said, I think because of the incredible forms that she set up for crime fiction, the murder of Roger Ackroyd as an unreliable narrator and all the rest of it. I said, I really think I have to give her, the kudos, as P.D. James used to say, because of they were original to her in so many ways. And now people are playing on them, that modern writers are. But here's the question that threw me, and I'm going to ask both of you. He then said to me, what's the book you've read that scared you the most? And I had to say to him, I really thought about it. There isn't one. And then last night, I mentioned that to Dana Stabenow, who's here, and my husband, and they both said, well, you don't read Stephen King. I thought, that's true. I don't. So I've never read The Shining. But Elly, is there a book that has, really scared you? Or Patrick, is there a book that's really frightened you?
Wow, what a great question
No
that is.
kidding. I
And
flunked
so,
the answer. I felt so stupid sitting there. Say, well,
do you know
no.
this is gonna sound very sort of pathetic, really, but I think this book's had an anniversary recently. But I was really scared by Watership Down. I think it's an amazing book, but the description of the stories of the Black Rabbit, who's the kind of devil rabbit, and then there's General Woundwort, who's the sort of fascist rabbit. And I guess I'd read it at quite a young age, but has really quite sort of adult themes, doesn't it? And I remember it giving me nightmares. And the only modern book that's given me a nightmare was a Sharon Bolton book, The Craftsman, about Sharon Bolton. I think is a terrific writer, and it's about a coffin maker. And so I guess Sharon. But if I had to pick my favourite mystery, to go back to your original question, Patrick, or the viewer's original question, it probably would be The Woman in White. I'm a huge
wow.
Wilkie Collins fan.
Excellent.
And I just love his books, and I love his sense of place and his sense of atmosphere. So, and all the different, the use of different narrators, I was probably go for The Woman in White. I'd be torn between that, The Moonstone, and No Name, but I think I'd go for The Woman in White. What about you, Patrick?
I don't know if I could pick a favorite mystery novel, but I was thinking about something that really scared me. Books that kind of flirt with madness in different ways. I think Edgar Allan Poe's stories really, at some point in my life, really scared me because, he's dealing with things like, being walled up, sort of
the Telltale Heart.
primal
The Cask of
fears.
Amontillado, right?
Cask of
Really
Amontillado,
scary.
exactly. The Fall of the House of Usher. He had that paranoia of being buried alive,
Benjamin,
and
yeah.
so things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if the reason I couldn't answer it is that I've always recognized it's fiction. I've just, I have been scared by movies. I remember Psycho terrified me. And when I was a kid, there was a movie called The Thing, which turned out to be a vegetable and they cooked it at the end. But I remember I was absolutely horrified by the thing. I was scared for weeks afterward. So maybe I had to, the visual thing will draw me in, whereas reading it, maybe it's just because I'm like one step removed from it or something.
Yeah, so maybe you read it with a sort of slight sense of detachment, trying to
Yeah.
solve it. And how interesting. Yes, what a great question, though.
It
And it's
was.
great. And you're so right about Agatha Christie as well. I think her sort of, because I wrote a Miss Marple story this year for
Right,
the
you did. And I
Marple.
love Marple. That's one of my favorite books of this year. It
Oh,
really is.
good. It was a really fun collection. It was great to read them all. But I was aware again of how clever she was with form,
Yeah.
and how experimental she was. And I don't think she gets enough credit for that, because people sort of think, oh, they're all the same, but they're also not the same, and
They're
so
not.
clever.
I reread her second husband, Max Mellon's autobiography before I wrote this chapter for Bloomsbury. Val McDermott wrote the introduction, and I wrote the end of it.
Wow.
And he has a thing, and he talks about how much she loved puzzles, how good she was at puzzles and mathematics and so forth. And I think that helped her. I mean, I also, it's my position that the best thing that ever happened to her was Archie Christie leaving her, because he was never going to be the right husband for a person who became successful, that earned more money, that, lived in her head. She was so fortunate, although the trauma of it was terrible for her at a time when divorce was such a disgrace,
Yes.
But I mean, I understand that, I've always thought she really did have PTSD, because for a woman brought up in the late Victorian age, to have a husband leave her for a mistress and be divorced would have been just like the worst trauma ever. But in truth, talk about what we were talking about earlier about happier endings and so forth. She was a really lucky woman that he fell in love with Nancy Neal, because they both played golf and went off to be golf obsessed and left Agatha to get on. Seriously. Wow.
And I have to say, from my point of view, it's a really good thing for a crime writer to be married to an archaeologist, as I am, and she was second time round. So definitely, I completely agree. It was in the end a very happy. Lucy Worsley's recent biography of Agatha Christie is very good on that period. I think very.
I haven't read it yet. I'd like to, but I haven't gotten around to it. But I hadn't realized just how great a memoir Max Mellon wrote. I was so happy to read it. I have this ancient book there, and I have Christie's autobiography, and also Come Tell Me How You Live, which was her memoir about her marriage to Max. And so it's particularly nice to read that, and then read his autobiography when it's his version of his marriage to Agatha. It's just great stuff.
I love
Sorry,
the thing
Patrick, we've digressed.
That's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Not at all. Let's see. Well, Jell, who's I think tuning in from Australia, says the book that really scared me was The Day of the Triffids, due to the wind rubbing branches against the veranda gutter as I was reading it.
Ooh, I bet that was a scary experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
I watched The Shining while working as a chambermaid in a hotel. So where you watch something or read something has a big effect. And never as a teenager watch The Shining in a hotel. Really, a slightly half-empty hotel. No.
I've actually stayed in that hotel, and I'm telling you, it's nothing like that. Yeah, it's in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and I've spent the night there, and it's actually quite sedate. So maybe that's one reason I never read The Shining. Maybe having stayed in the hotel, I thought it was never going to have that kind of impact on me.
Yeah, it's quite a book. He really taps into a lot of our primal fears all in one package. Let's see. Okay, Jill has another question. Do you find it hard growing the characters as you write their next book? That's how it's worded.
Oh, that's a great question. Do it's one of the things that I really like doing, and Barbara and I sort of touched on it a bit. The whole idea that you feel a bit sad if you don't get to write the next bit in a character's life. So that's something that I really enjoy doing. Following a character as they grow and as they change and as things happen to them, to make them the people who they are. So It's not something that I find difficult, and something that I do really enjoy. But not to say that it isn't something that I work on, because I do. But it is just an aspect of the writing that I really enjoy, and it feels a privilege. Really, it feels a real privilege to have. I've written 15 books about Ruth and Nelson and their wider circle, and I just feel really lucky to have been able to do that. You know how wonderful that is. It does feel a real privilege, I have to say.
It seems like some authors try not to. They want to keep their characters almost frozen in amber.
Yeah.
You know.
And I guess that's not wrong. I mean, Lee Child is very open about that with Reacher, isn't he? With Jack Reacher, he says he's not going to
Right,
grow, he's not going to change, he's not going to age.
right.
And I did a Zoom yesterday with Peter James, who's a good friend and a local author here, and writes the Brilliant Roy Grace books. And he said, oh, he was 39 at the beginning of the books, and 26 books later he's 41. But he said a lot of them happen in the same year or something.
Yeah.
But for me, it was quite. I really enjoyed my characters aging and changing and growing in real time. That was quite important to me, and also it was quite important to me that they, given the traumatic things that characters in crime novels go through, I thought was really good to show that they are changed by them.
Hmm. Right. Here's maybe a good final question. Norby from, what is this, YouTube? Will you ever do any short spin-off books looking into the characters' lives from the Galloway series?
Oh, what a great question. And do you know what? I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to write, we're going to publish a selection of short stories next year, some of which will be stories that I've already written, but some of which will be like these little moments in the lives of characters that I didn't have time to write before. So, for example, various Christmases that Ruth and Nelson have had that we don't know about. I'd love to write one about Ruth at school. She grew up in South London, an area I know really well, but quite a historic area. So I'd like to write about that. I'd like to write about, Max and Edgar in the war and what they did in the war. I'd love to write about Justice as an adult. Harbinder's first day as a police officer. So yes, that's such a great question, and it is something that I think I will do. Cathbad's growing up in Ireland.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to
Right.
do.
He and Judy are an amazing couple. No,
Oh, thank you.
that would be wonderful. Wow. Well, we've, as always, digressed all over the place, but
Great.
if you're going to talk for an hour about a book in which you will spoil everything after you just briefly set it up, you have to digress. So thank you all for sticking with us. Elly, as always, has been an absolute joy to talk to you.
It's been such a pleasure, Barbara. Thank you so much. And thank you, Patrick. And can I just say also, Barbara, thank you for all your support, because you have been there for me right from the beginning. So thank you.
Well, it's really my pleasure. And as a favor to me, give Jane Wood my regards, because it's been way too long since
I
I've
really
talked to her.
will. Next
I'm
time you're in
so
London.
happy.
Okay, here's an idea. Next time we're in London, 3 of us lunch Bleeding Heart Yard.
We could do that. That would be
We could do
absolutely
that.
wonderful. All right. Well, anyway,
Okay.
thank you all for joining.